It was a bitter January night. The kind where the cold bites through your skin, where the wind carries whispers through the empty Indiana backroads. A car moves through the darkness, 4 teenage girls inside, and one terrified 12-year-old who will never make it home. The girl in the back seat shifts uncomfortably. She doesn't know why they've driven so far. She doesn't know where they're going. But something in her gut tells her, this isn't a prank. This isn't a joke. This is something else. Then, the car stops. Get out. No one hears the screams. No one sees what happens next. But by morning, the world will know. A farmer making his morning rounds sees smoke rising from a field. He steps forward, but stops. His breath catches in his throat. His hands begin to shake. Before that night, before the terror and the cruelty, before her name was whispered in hushed tones across the country, she was just a girl, a daughter, a friend, a bright spark of life in a world that would fail her. Shanda Renee Scherer was born on June 6, 1979 in Pineville, Kentucky, a small town tucked into the rolling hills of Appalachia. She was the second daughter of Stephen Scherer and Jacqueline Vaught. From the moment she entered the world, she was a child full of light, curious, playful, and full of endless energy. Her parents' marriage didn't last, and soon after their divorce, Shanda moved with her mother to Indiana. It was a fresh start, a new town, but for a child, change can be difficult. Shanda had to adjust, new places, new people, new schools. But no matter where she went, one thing remained the same: she had a way of drawing people in. She was bright, outgoing, and loved to make friends. She had a kind heart, the kind that made her easy to love. She wasn't just a good student. She was a cheerleader, a gymnast, a young girl full of life and promise. As Shanda grew, so did her world. New friendships, new experiences. And one friendship in particular would change everything. Amanda Heavrin was a little older, a little bolder. The two met in middle school and quickly became inseparable. Some said they were just close friends. Others whispered it was something more. But Shanda's friendship with Amanda didn't go unnoticed. There was someone else watching. Someone who wasn't happy. Melinda Lovelace had once been Amanda's girlfriend. And to her, Shanda wasn't just a new friend, she was a threat. At first it was subtle. The whispers, the glares, the notes passed in secret, warning Shanda to stay away. But soon it became more than just words. Melinda's jealousy festered. Her anger grew. And as it did, so did her plans. No one could have known that this simple teenage drama would soon become something far more dangerous. Something brutal. Something irreversible. Monsters aren't born overnight. They are shaped, molded by their pasts, by their pain, by the darkness they choose to embrace. The 4 girls who took Shanda Scherer's life weren't faceless shadows. They had names, histories, and somewhere deep within them, a darkness waiting to be unleashed. If there was one person who set this nightmare in motion, it was Melinda Lovelace. The girl who couldn't let go. The girl whose obsession with Amanda Heavrin twisted into something far more dangerous. Melinda was born into a world of cruelty. Her father, Larry Lovelace, was a convicted sex offender, a man known for his violence, his rage, his control. Behind closed doors he ruled with terror, beatings, humiliations, and worse. Melinda and her sisters lived in fear, their childhood stolen by the very man meant to protect them. But it wasn't just physical pain. It was the kind of fear that changes you, that makes you question love, that teaches you that control is power. Her parents divorced when she was young, but the damage had already been done. The father's abuse, the mother's neglect, a world where love meant pain. And when Melinda met Amanda Heavrin, she clung to her. Possessive, protective, desperate. Amanda was hers, no one else's. But then, Amanda met someone new, someone younger, sweeter, innocent. And in Melinda's mind, there was only one way to fix that. Lori Tackett was different. Where Melinda was fueled by jealousy, Lori was fueled by something else. Something colder. A fascination with pain. A hunger for destruction. Born into a strict religious household in Madison, Indiana, Lori's childhood was a contradiction. Raised by parents who preached fire and brimstone, yet inside their home the darkness was just as thick. Her mother was obsessive about religion, controlling Lori's every move. But Lori didn't fear hellfire. She embraced it. She was fascinated by the macabre, death, torture, pain. She spoke about killing. Not in whispers, but with laughter. And when she met Melinda Lovelace, it was a match made in hell. Not all monsters start that way. Some are made. Some are led. And some just follow. Hope Rippey and Tony Lawrence weren't killers. Not at first. They were normal, or as normal as two girls with troubled pasts could be. They had their own struggles, their own wounds. But they weren't like Melinda and Lori. They weren't violent. But sometimes all it takes is the wrong friend, the wrong influence, the wrong night. Neither of them knew fully what was going to happen that night. But they were there. And in the end, that made all the difference. 4 girls. 4 lives shaped by pain, neglect, anger, and manipulation. Each of them carrying their own scars. But scars don't excuse cruelty. Trauma doesn't justify torture. And broken childhoods don't erase the horror of what they did. But the question remains, if these girls had lived different lives, would Shanda still be alive? It started like any other friendship. A chance meeting. A spark of connection. A bond that felt safe, at first. Shanda Scherer met Amanda Heverin at Hazelwood Middle School in the fall of 1991. Shanda was new, trying to find her place. Amanda was already part of a different world, one Shanda didn't yet understand. The two grew close quickly. Some called them best friends. Others believed it was something more. Notes were passed, hands lingered too long, stolen glances turned into late-night phone calls. For Shanda it was exciting. For Amanda it was a way to move on. And for Melinda Loveless, it was an unforgivable betrayal. Melinda Loveless was not the kind of girl who let go easily. When Amanda drifted toward Shanda, Melinda didn't just feel hurt, she felt replaced. And in her world, love was something you had to control. She wrote letters. Threats. She told Amanda she hated Shanda. That she wanted to hurt her. That she wanted her gone. At first it was just words. Just jealousy. But jealousy has a way of turning into something darker. Something dangerous. And by the end of 1991, Melinda had made a decision. Shanda wouldn't just be scared. She wouldn't just be hurt. She would be eliminated. Melinda knew she couldn't do it alone. She needed help. And she knew exactly who to call. Lori Tackett didn't hesitate. She was excited. She wanted to see someone suffer. She wanted to be part of something real. And so the plan was set. But they needed more than just 2. They needed bodies. A distraction. Someone to make Shanda feel safe. They weren't killers. Not yet. But they were persuadable. Easily pulled into the orbit of stronger, darker personalities. And when Lori invited them out that night, they didn't ask questions. They just went. The night was cold. The roads dark, the air heavy with the kind of silence that comes before something terrible happens. Their destination? Shanda's house. Tony Lawrence and Hope Rippey went to the door first. Smiling. Friendly. They weren't strangers. They weren't a threat. Just 2 girls with an invitation. They told her they were there to take her to Amanda. That Amanda wanted to see her. That all the drama, all the fighting, it was over. Shanda hesitated, but in the end she trusted them. She slipped on her shoes, pulled on her jacket, and stepped out into the night. It was a trap. And by the time Shanda realized it, it was already too late. This wasn't a ride to see Amanda. This was the first step toward something unimaginable. For the first few minutes, Shanda thought this was just a misunderstanding. Maybe even a cruel prank. But as the car sped away from her home, the streetlights fading into the distance, a deep unease began to settle in her chest. She asked where Amanda was, when she would see her. But the answers were vague, deflecting. Then, they stopped answering altogether. And then the mood shifted. Just slightly at first. "We're not going to Amanda," Melinda finally said. And then she pulled out a knife. Melinda's voice was calm. Almost amused. She told Shanda to take off her bra. That she wanted it as a souvenir. When Shanda hesitated, Melinda leaned in, pressing the cold blade against her cheek. They drove for miles. Out of town. Out of safety. Into the unknown. Shanda begged them to take her home. She promised she wouldn't tell anyone. She cried. But her tears only made them laugh. Then they stopped the car. They took her to an abandoned, rundown house. Lori's favorite spot for scaring people. Only tonight this wasn't just for scaring. This was something worse. They stripped her. Bound her wrists with rope. Gagged her. Then Melinda got close. Inches from her face. She whispered something that made Shanda's stomach drop. "I hate you," she said. "Amanda loves me, not you." And then the beatings began. Melinda punched her. Again. 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 Lori joined in, kicking her ribs, laughing when she heard them crack. Hope and Tony, silent at first, watched. Frozen. But as the hours dragged on, even they stopped hesitating. Lori pulled out a rope. They strangled her. Over and over. Watching her choke, then letting go just before she passed out. Hours passed. But it wasn't enough. They weren't finished. They kept driving. Looking for the perfect place to end it. They stopped at a remote field. Pulled her out of the car. Beat her again. They stabbed her. Not deep enough to kill. Just enough to make her suffer. But somehow, even after all of this, Shanda was still breathing. They needed to end it. And so, they made a final decision. One that would make sure she never survived. They drove to a secluded spot. A field near an abandoned logging road. They dragged Shanda out. She could barely stand. Could barely open her swollen eyes. But she knew what was coming. And then they lit her on fire. Shanda's body twitched. Her fingers curled. She was still alive. They got back in the car. And drove away. By sunrise, all that was left was a smoldering corpse on a forgotten road. And the world was about to learn the monstrous truth behind what happened that night. The morning of January 11, 1992, was cold. The sun had barely risen over Jefferson County, Indiana, as two hunters made their way down an old logging road. They weren't looking for trouble. Just another day. Another hunt. But within moments, their morning would take a turn so horrifying, so unimaginable, that it would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The smell hit them first. A sickly, acrid stench that didn't belong in the crisp morning air. Then they saw it. At first, they weren't sure what they were looking at. A pile of charred debris? A burned animal? But then, they saw the shape. The outline. The remnants of what could only be human. The authorities arrived within the hour. And what they found was something out of a nightmare. The remains were so badly burned that, at first, investigators couldn't even determine the gender. But as forensic examiners carefully examined what little was left, the truth became clear. There were signs of blunt force trauma, fractures to the skull and ribs. But those injuries weren't what killed her. She had been stabbed multiple times, strangled, beaten mercilessly. But the most chilling discovery of all? Shanda had been alive when she was set on fire. Who could have done something so inhuman, so monstrous? The answer was closer than they realized. The next evening, a 16-year-old girl walked into the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department. She was shaking. Well, something was weighing on her. Something she could no longer keep inside. Her name was Toni Lawrence. And she had a story to tell. And then, in a broken, trembling voice, she started talking. "We killed her," she said. We burned her alive." The room went still. At first, the officers could barely process what they were hearing. This wasn't just any crime. This wasn't some accident or reckless mistake. This was planned, executed, carried out with cruelty that defied all logic. The confession sent shockwaves through the department. But they needed evidence. They needed to connect names to this unthinkable crime. Toni Lawrence gave them everything. She named names, told them where to find them, gave them details only someone who had been there could know. First, they found Hope Rippey, a 15-year-old girl who had laughed while her friend was burned alive. Then came Lori Tackett, the one who took pleasure in the violence, the one who had smiled through it all. And finally, the mastermind herself, Melinda Loveless, the girl whose jealousy turned into something evil. With every confession, every new piece of evidence, the truth became clearer. But it also became darker. By the end of that night, the case was no longer a mystery. The pieces had fallen into place. And the world was about to learn the full, horrific truth. 4 teenage girls had committed one of the most sadistic, unthinkable murders in modern history. And now, they would have to face justice. The trial of Melinda Loveless, Lori Tackett, Hope Rippey, and Toni Lawrence wasn't just about justice. It was about understanding the depths of human cruelty. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled every available seat, cameras flashing as the 4 teenagers were led in, wrists bound in shackles. Their faces, unreadable. At the center of it all sat the people who had suffered most, Shanda Scherer's parents. The prosecution laid out the horrifying details of that night, the deception, the torture, the brutality. The evidence was overwhelming. The confessions, the forensics, the sickening details from the autopsy, it all painted the same picture. A premeditated, sadistic act of violence. But then came the defense. Her lawyers argued that Melinda was a victim herself, that her childhood, filled with abuse, neglect, and trauma, shaped her into the monster she became. Lori Tackett's defense was similar. They portrayed her as a troubled teen, one who had been corrupted by horror movies, satanic influences, and her own dark fascinations. But for Hope Rippey and Tony Lawrence, the strategy was different. They were painted as followers. Weak, impressionable. Girls who had been swept up in the violence but had never intended to kill. Then came the hardest part of the trial. "You didn't just take my daughter's life," she says, eyes locked onto Melinda. "You took everything from me. From us. And I will never forgive you." Shanda's father, Stephen, couldn't even finish his statement. Halfway through, he broke down, overcome with grief. The pain in the courtroom was palpable. And then, the verdict was read. The court handed down its sentences. Some were expected. Others shocked the nation. Tony Lawrence, 20 years. Paroled after 9. Hope Rippey, 60 years. Reduced to 35. Lori Tackett, 60 years. Melinda Loveless, 60 years. For many, justice had been served. But for others, the punishments weren't enough. The fact that Tony Lawrence walked free after just 9 years was seen as an insult to Shanda's memory. "My daughter was tortured for hours. They burned her alive. And they get to go free?" Even more shocking, in 2019, Melinda Loveless was granted parole after serving only 26 years. So now we ask you, was justice truly served? Did the sentences fit the crime? Or did these girls get off too easy? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Because cases like this should never be forgotten. Justice may have been served in the eyes of the law, but for Shanda Scherer's family, the pain never faded. The weight of losing a child in such a horrific way is something no parent should ever bear. And for Jackie Vaught, Shanda's mother, the grief turned into a lifelong mission. Jackie refused to let Shanda's death be just another crime statistic. She became a relentless advocate, fighting for stricter sentencing laws and justice for other victims of violence. She worked tirelessly, speaking at schools, warning young girls about toxic relationships, manipulation and violence. But the pain never truly left her. Shanda's father, Stephen Scherer, never recovered. 4 years he lived under a shadow of anger and grief. The thought of what his daughter endured tormented him. He tried to move on, but the pain consumed him. In 2005, Stephen was found dead in his home. The official cause? Alcoholism. But those who knew him said he died of a broken heart. One family. 2 tragic losses. All because of a crime that should have never happened. And what about the 4 girls responsible for this nightmare? Time has passed. They have grown older. But the question remains, did they change? Or did they simply escape true justice? The ringleader of the attack, Melinda Loveless, was sentenced to 60 years in prison. But in 2019, after serving just 26 years, she walked free. Today Melinda is a free woman. But freedom doesn't mean forgiveness. Her release sparked outrage. People questioned, how does someone responsible for such a brutal crime get to walk among us again? But in an unexpected twist, Melinda, the same girl who once burned a child alive, now works with rescue dogs. Jackie Vaught, Shanda's mother, even said in an interview that she forgave Melinda and was glad she was helping animals. But can someone like Melinda Loveless ever truly change? Lori Tackett, perhaps the most sadistic of the group, was also sentenced to 60 years. And just like Melinda, she was released. But does she deserve it? Hope Rippey and Tony Lawrence, the so-called followers, got off with lighter sentences. Tony was the first to crack under guilt. But does that make her innocent? Hope Rippey, meanwhile, walked free in 2006. She lives a normal life now, working, socializing, blending into society. And so we are left with the biggest question of all. Can someone who commits a crime this heinous ever truly change? Can we believe in rehabilitation, or is evil something that never fades? There are crimes that shock us, that shake us to our core. But perhaps what makes this case so deeply disturbing is the fact that the perpetrators weren't hardened criminals. They were teenagers. They were just kids. And yet, they carried out a crime so monstrous, so unforgivable, it left an entire nation struggling to understand. How does jealousy turn into murder? How does peer pressure turn into torture? And how do 4 teenage girls come together to destroy one innocent life and feel nothing? This case forces us to ask questions we may not want the answers to. For Jackie Vaught, Shanda's mother, the pain never stopped. She lost a daughter, her world shattered. And even after justice was served, it was never enough. Shanda's father, Stephen, never got to see justice through. The weight of his daughter's suffering became too much to bear. And what about Amanda Heavrin, the girl at the center of Melinda's jealousy? 4 years she lived under the stigma of this case. Blamed, judged, forever linked to a crime she never committed. This case destroyed so many lives, but only one person paid the ultimate price. Be kind. Be vigilant. Speak up. Cases like this remind us of one chilling truth. Monsters aren't always strangers in the dark. Sometimes they sit next to us in class. They send us text messages. They wear a friendly smile, until the moment they don't. Bullying, jealousy, peer pressure. They may seem like small things, but left unchecked they can become deadly. So I leave you with this. If you see something, if you feel something is off, speak up. If Shanda had gotten help earlier, if someone had noticed the signs, would she still be alive today? We'll never know. True crime cases like this need to be told. They serve as warnings, lessons, and reminders of the world we live in. If you found this deep dive insightful, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another case. And if you want more shocking true crime stories, check out my next video, where we uncover another twisted, unbelievable case. Let's keep the conversation going in the comments. Do you believe the killers truly changed? Should they have been released? Let's discuss.